Hello, I'm Barry Pavel, Senior Vice President and Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, and I'd like to welcome you all to the inaugural event for the Future Foreign Policy Series in our newest initiative in the Scowcroft Center, the New American Engagement Initiative. This new event series is designed to foster discussions about some of the key underlying assumptions that have guided U.S. foreign policy and to engage in a critical assessment of the policies that flow from these core assumptions. It's been a long time since some of these assumptions were developed. This series is conducted within the context of the broader Atlantic Council mission, which is oriented around shaping the global future together. The Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security in the Atlantic Council works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the U.S.'s closest allies and partners. The Scowcroft Center honors the legacy of service of the late General Brent Scowcroft. The center embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We are honored today to host our very first Future Foreign Policy Series guest, Representative Ro Khanna of California. Representative Khanna has regularly put forward new ideas to rethink and reshape U.S. foreign policy to better align it with the world we are now in. He has worked across the aisle on a wide range of issues, including the president's ability to wage war, U.S. support for the war in Yemen in particular, and reforms of the U.S. armed forces, among many other important issues that no doubt will be discussed today. These are all issues that are worthy of vigorous debate and deliberation. And this is a momentous time for the United States. There is domestic upheaval and partisan and ideological polarization, demonstrated most dramatically by the attack on the Capitol earlier this month. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to wreak havoc, claiming so many lives and historic economic dislocation and real lasting human costs. Still, we in the United States don't have the luxury of only attending to these historic domestic challenges. The world is still spinning and presenting one of the most challenging and complex set of challenges for U.S. security and prosperity in recent memory. So now may be just the right time to seek to reimagine an adapted leadership role for the United States in the world. And that begins by engaging with close U.S. allies and partners, but also sustaining diplomacy with U.S. competitors such as China and Russia. The Future Foreign Policy Series is dedicated to the goal of reinvigorating the foreign policy debate with new ideas, unconventional approaches for U.S. global engagement, and we are so appreciative that Representative Khanna has joined us today in pursuit of that mission. We're also fortunate to have with us Jen Kirby, Foreign Affairs and National Security reporter at Vox, to moderate the conversation. Jen has a deep knowledge of foreign affairs and has reported widely on key foreign policy decisions, including those that do not always receive front page attention. Her coverage has provided space for a broader debate on U.S. foreign policy, and her work makes her perfectly suited to be the first moderator of this series. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this event. If you have questions you would like to ask Representative Khanna, please submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom or tweet them to @ACScowcroft on Twitter. With that, over to you, Jen, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm really happy to be here and to kick off this series and have a conversation with Representative Khanna. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Barry. And thank you to Chris for inviting me.
So I wanted to just sort of start out. There's a lot to discuss, particularly foreign policy wise, and how much of that intersects with U.S. domestic policy right now. But you have often been seen as a leader in progressive foreign policy. And I'm wondering for everyone here, if you can kind of just give a sort of sense of what that might mean, and particularly what it means in 2021.
Well, I take my inspiration in American foreign policy from two of America's great leaders, John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln, and perhaps three, Dr. King. John Quincy Adams famously said that we ought to be championing the cause of liberty, the cause of peace. We ought to be praying for it. We ought to be cheering it. but we ought to be skeptical of going overseas militarily and trying to impose that, because when we try to do that, it's not that we don't have universal values, it's that we won't be able to determine whether we are actually on the side of liberty or not. So his was a belief, definitely in Enlightenment values of liberty and freedom and engagement with the world, but a caution about militarily imposing it. And then Lincoln, most famously, of course, talks about America's values being universal values and the last hope, the best hope in seeing those values around the world, a sense of understanding the dignity of every person. And I think Dr. King articulates that in forcing us to recognize the dignity and rights of people outside the United States as equally important as a nation that believes in those rights. So that is the philosophical frame. And then there are many cases where the United States has lived up to that. Most personally, in my case, my grandfather spent 4 years in jail with Gandhi, and it was FDR who was a force for decolonization. And I'd like to see America continue to live up to that tradition.
So you talk about this American tradition and our values abroad. And I wonder, we've had a pretty chaotic year here in the US. Of course, everyone has been dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and the economic fallout. But in the US particularly, we've seen a racial justice reckoning over the summer with protests. And of course, we've had a tumultuous transition period, to say the least, which culminated in the Capitol attack on January 6th, where, based on this false belief that the election was stolen. And I wonder, how does the US promote those values abroad, given what we've seen happen here and the struggles of our own democracy at home?
Well, what the United States is trying to do is extraordinary. There has never been a multiracial, multi-ethnic immigrant nation in the history of the world. People talk about Canada. Canada is about 80% white. Britain is almost 80% white. Australia, almost 80% white. We're 60% white. We're 40% of people from all different other parts of the world. And post-1965 America, where you have literally people from every corner of the globe, what we're trying to do is extraordinarily hard. And I view the pain that we're going through, the challenges that we're going through, as part of a process of trying to do something truly great, of trying to become a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. And of course, the forces for democracy won. Yes, we had the insubordination, insurrection, but it was a Republican vice president, a Republican majority leader, Republican state legislatures that ultimately had Joe Biden and Kamala Harris certified. So I have hope in our democracy. We can talk about problems, but I ultimately am quite optimistic that we will get there.
Yeah, I agree that the American experiment is certainly still an experiment in so many ways. But I think, as you said before, the US has sometimes lived up to its values and sometimes failed to live up to its values. But in the US, one of the things we have managed to do very successfully, that has been the example, has been the peaceful transfer of power. When one person loses, the other side, the loser accepts the outcome, and then we transition. And that did happen, but it took a lot to get there. And I wonder how we can convince other countries that we want to embrace democracy, human rights, our values, that our path is still the right one. How do we restore our credibility, essentially?
Well, I don't think that the standing up for democracy and human rights are particular values that people have to look at just America. I think these are universal truths. I think, first of all, I don't think they're just Western values. I think there have been democracies that have flourished in other parts of the world. Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate economist and philosopher, writes about the democratic traditions in many other cultures. So to me, these are universal values. And when we stand up for democracy, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in China or whether it's in India, and we say we are for this, I think these are objectively objectively better ways to organize society. I would say a democratic liberal democracy is a morally superior choice than an authoritarian a government. And then we should say, okay, when we have this ideal, how close are we to living up to our own ideal, and how close are other countries? So people say, well, America has work to do to get to this ideal. I would say, absolutely, you're right. But it doesn't take away individual Americans' ability to speak for values that I believe are fundamental and universal and true.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder too, with this new administration, we have a new perspective, or maybe it's an old perspective on foreign policy, of re-engagement with partners and allies, and sort of, the idea that America will now be back at the table and willing to discuss it. And that has been sort of, on broad brushstrokes, Biden's plan. And I'm wondering what you think about that approach, and if you would amend it or edit it in any way at all.
I believe he's off to a very strong start. I think that he has offered a start of humility. He said, I understand that, I think John Kerry said, I understand we've been not participating in 4 years, and we're not going to come in and just dictate to the rest of the world what to do. We're here to listen. We're here to learn, and we're here to do our part and lead and make up for times where we haven't been engaged. We've seen, of course, on climate, a huge reversal from the previous administration. We've seen on Yemen, something I care deeply about, a reversal. I think Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan have done a terrific job in reassessing that entire strategy and are committed to seeing an end to the Yemen war. We're taking a re-look at Iran and understanding that the complexity going back to Mossadegh, where again, I think the British were probably more to blame than the Americans in a lot of how that started the conflict. But how do we reset that relationship so that we aren't entangled into conflict in the Middle East? And the Biden administration has been strong there. So it's only been a week in, but so far I think they are off to a strong start.
You brought up Yemen and the Biden administration's commitment to end backing for Saudi Arabia in that war, which has been an issue that you've advocated for a long time. And so I imagine, as you said, you were pleased to hear that. And you've also, in that advocacy, have tried to get a bigger role for Congress in some of these discussions. And I wonder, the Biden administration has made this pledge. What role do you see Congress as playing in sort of either holding him to that promise, or perhaps even going farther than the administration's initial proposal?
Well, I believed in Article 1 when Donald Trump was president, and I believe in Article 1 when Joe Biden was president. This is why I said we should still pass the War Powers Resolution, even though I have complete faith, actually, in Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan's commitment to end the war. I think Congress needs to set a clear definition that war and peace is Congress's prerogative, and that the framers trusted Congress for a reason. It's much harder. Trust me, it's very hard to get things done in Congress, as everyone knows. And it's supposed to, that's why they wanted Congress to act on war. They wanted it to be really, really hard to go to war and to get entangled overseas. And just like it's hard to get things through Congress, they wanted to make it clear that Congress would be the body, and that we would only go to war when it was really necessary. And by the way, at times where it's been really necessary, like after 9/11, after we were attacked in Pearl Harbor, it's been very easy for the president to mobilize and get that authority. So we are going to continue to press. I think we need to have a more thought out and expanded War Powers Act. I'd like us to pass the War Powers Resolution in Yemen, both because I think it'll expedite and send a message to end the war in Yemen, but also that it'll send a clear delineation of Congress reasserting our prerogative over war and peace.
I definitely want to talk about Congress's role in war and peace, but I want to ask too more about sort of the broader Saudi relationship. And, after the death of Jamal Khashoggi and of course, what's happening in Yemen, there has been a broader rethink about the U.S.-Saudi partnership. And I'm wondering what you see for the future of that relationship.
Well, it's a relationship that should be based on values and interests. I mean, first of all, strategically, the Middle East just doesn't matter nearly as much as it once used to. It's 3.5% of global GDP. Just to put that in comparison, China is about 15%, we're about 20% of global GDP. I think future historians, when they write about things from just a foreign policy perspective, will wonder what the United States was so bogged down in places like Iran, which is 0.44% of global GDP. People talk about the Strait of Hormuz, but India and China and Asia are far more dependent. It's sort of the United States, and I'm fine with our fleet being there. We do a service to the world and keeping the seas open. But trust me, that there are other countries that have a huge interest in keeping that open. So one, I think we have to understand that our strategic interests in the Middle East are less. And then you say, well, what are our moral interests? How can we be supporting a regime that is killing journalists, speaking about an unthinkable war? How can we be supporting a regime that is committing atrocities in Yemen? I'm always for redemption and resetting the relationship, but the predicate for that has to be that they stop the war, they lift the blockade, and then we have a relationship that's not based on a balance of power politics. I mean, we shouldn't be thinking, let's play the Saudis against Iran and all of this sort of manipulative coalition building where we think we're going to outsmart those countries. It hasn't worked. It's what's led to us supporting Iraq against Iran and then it becoming an enemy. And I just think we need a cleaner approach based on our values. And I don't think people like FDR or Lincoln or our great leaders of Washington would have played that kind of balance of power politics, which really emerged out of the Cold War and is an outdated framework.
And to that point, you've also been just sort of broadly critical of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And I think we saw this week that the new administration is at least reviewing sales to both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I'm curious what you think about that, and also how we should be thinking about arms sales to the Middle East, but just sort of more broadly in general.
We should, I'm very pleased that Secretary Blinken took that position and to review the arms sales. And we need to look at largely tied to the Yemen war. And I think that's the source of leverage we have. And I understand there are times where arms sales are necessary. I'm not saying, okay, don't have arms sales. But here's what I hope for the United States. I want people, when they think of the United States, to think about our music, to think about people like Amanda Gorman, our poetry, about our science. I want them to think we were the nation that's discovering the vaccines. We're the nation that is leading the world in artificial intelligence and quantum computing and science and our movies, our incredible culture. That should be what touches people, is the sense of almost a nation that is universal in aspiration. Where entrepreneurship and innovation is possible. And I fear that too many times, unfortunately, the experience that people have in the other part of the world is one of two things: either American embassies, which candidly can be very rude at times. We're getting better, but they can be. There needs to be a greater thoughtfulness in how the embassies interact with countries, or our arms or our military. And that's not the essence of America. It's not. We're never going to be remembered, nor should we aspire to be remembered as the greatest power that existed. We should be aspired to be remembered as the greatest philosophical project that has existed in humanity.
And so I guess then the question is, where do we start to try to flip the balance? And particularly, not only where do we start, but what is Congress's role, do you think, in actually trying to kind of reorient the perception of America away from that sort of military defense perspective?
Well, I think we want to be engaged in efforts that can promote our trade, our ideas, engage in supporting initiatives around the world to tackle climate change, global poverty. of course, we want a strong defense. No one is saying that we don't need a strong defense, but we need to think, what is the modern defense of the 21st century, and what does it look like in an expanded, with expanded threats? One of the things that shocked me, I just learned this. We have about a $740 billion defense budget, about 8 times more than the rest of the world. We have a $100 million budget for the NIH which is doing incredible work on coming up with a universal diagnostic for any vaccine. And we have 100 million for them to come up with a universal vaccine therapy. Now, why aren't we spending, as Bill Gates would say, 10 times as much, probably 50 times as much of that? Would it really hurt our national security if we were spending $738 billion on defense and had $1 billion each for scientists at NIH to be doing research to prevent a $16 trillion loss on the pandemic? These are the types of common sense questions that I think many people are having about how we rethink what is security in the 21st century. Cybersecurity. We're susceptible to SolarWinds attack. Have we thought about what we need to do to have SolarWinds engage in software verification? And maybe we should be investing in that instead of an aircraft carrier. So I think sometimes people misunderstand progressives and say, oh, they're just for cutting the military. No, we're not for cutting the military. We're for making a 21st century modern, secure state that's engaged in the rest of the world.
I mean, and it sounds like, this is not just a matter of the size of the budget, but also the allocation of where we're actually investing. But when it does come to, where we should reinvest perhaps some of the money, how much should be, what do you see? Do you see the priority as investing here at home to kind of fix some of the issues that we talked about to make us sort of a stronger democracy society so that when we go abroad, we have kind of our example? Or is it about reinvesting in kind of softer diplomacy, things like, the State Department or initiatives like COVAX or something like that? Where do you sort of see that balance?
The amazing thing about the United States is we can do both. Usually, the challenge with developing nations, frankly, is they have this huge choice. Do they support innovation and entrepreneurship or growth, or do they support political justice? And in our country, I represent a district, Silicon Valley, we are producing incredible wealth. My district has done tremendously in the pandemic because of the digitization of the economy. Billionaires have made $1 trillion. So we have the resources in this country to make sure that, one, every person gets an education that they want, which is going to make us globally competitive. Every person has healthcare so that they can be productive. These are things that the United States has the capacity to do. And we have the capacity to make sure we're investing in leading technology. I think what's going to determine whether we win the 21st century or China wins is whether we lead in artificial intelligence and quantum computing and synthetic biology and clean energy, or whether we lose that lead to China. I'm confident we will lead because of innovation and diversity and risk-taking, but we have to be intentional about that. And then we still have resources to engage in the State Department and diplomacy and helping with global poverty. I don't think we should do it the way China does it, which is with the Silken Road Initiative, is almost a form of soft colonialism, where they're giving countries money and then taking a stake in them. I don't think that should be the American attitude. I would think we ought to be doing it out of our own values, which is to encourage human flourishing in other societies and to be on the side of those causes. And I think we have the resources to do that.
We can do both, but sometimes the US is not great at doing both. And what I also wonder about is, how do you sell that vision to the American people? What seems to have been the lesson, I think, from the Trump years, regardless of the position of the foreign policy, was there was a fatigue with the sense of America being overextended, the kinds of forever wars that I know that you've spoken out against. And I wonder, how do you make the case that the US needs to be a credible and competent actor abroad, while also making sure, how do you sort of sell that case to the public who wants, investment at home?
Well, first, by not painting every Trump voter with a broad brush. I've met a lot of Trump voters. They're not all the people who stormed the Capitol with Confederate flags and white supremacy. There are a lot of people in communities that our country did ignore. There are people, places, communities, with rural America in parts where kids are having to leave their hometown because they're dying. The churches are shrinking. They're not part of the modern economy. We saw and presided over deindustrialization. People have lost some of their pride. And some of them are saying, what about us? Where do we fit in globalization? Where do we fit in this new world? And I think that's why the domestic is so important. Before we could convince them to care about global poverty, we have to convince them that we understand their pain. We understand their anxieties. We're going to make sure that they can stay in their communities, build vibrant downtowns, invest in those communities. When it comes to differences in truth, one of the things is the cynicism about government, right? Since Watergate, there's been a cynicism about government. Most people think members of Congress, well, they're just answering to their campaign donors. The election officials, well, they're just doing things for partisan advantage. People have lost faith in government's ability to do things that are fair, and they think everything we want to do is about winning. It's one of the reasons I think you've had this loss of confidence in the election result, because people think, oh, everyone does that, and they're all just doing whatever it takes to win. So what we have to do, I think, is rebuild the economy in this country, rebuild institutions of trust in this country that participate in a democracy with a fairness of reasonable exchange, like our initial town halls, understanding that it's not a Pollyannish vision. I mean, there were newspapers at our founding where the Republicans told the Republican truth and the other parties told the other truth. I mean, it's not, but we need to get back to some sense of a common culture, common aspiration as a country. I think if we do that, then it becomes easier to convince people to be engaged overseas. And I think if we stop wasting all these resources in these wars, it becomes easier to convince people to be engaged overseas.
Yes, and I think the forever wars are a big part of that. And I am curious, I know that as part of your mission to kind of bring the question of national security and defense back to Congress, there has been sort of the question of what do we do about the AUMF, the authorization of the use of military force, which came after 9/11 and which has now been used in Libya and Somalia and far outreached what it was initially used for, and has now going to be used by potentially a fourth president. And I know this week, so your colleague from California and some others had sent a letter to Biden. Do you think that Biden will be the fourth and final president under that AUMF? And how is Congress going to make that happen?
Well, not if Barbara Lee has anything to do with it, but I often joke with her that if there was a sequel to John F. Kennedy's book of Profile in Courage, there would be a chapter on it to Barbara Lee, who, if you watch her House speech, it's not that she was opposed to attacking Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. What she was warning about is that the authorization of force was too broadly written and would be abused in the future. And surely enough, it was. And she's built an amazing coalition with Republicans. I've seen a lot of the Republicans who really respect her in the repeal. Then the question becomes, the hard part is, well, what do you replace it with? And that's what we have to get correct. And we ought to do it. And actually, Pete Buttigieg had a good idea on the campaign trail that it ought to have a sunset clause. These things shouldn't be indefinite. And I think that is something that we really ought to do in these next 2 years. And it could be another place of bipartisanship. I found that these are areas actually where you can get Republicans, even in the Freedom Caucus in particular, to agree.
And that's a really good point, that, and particularly a lot of the initiatives that you've worked on around Yemen last year with around the potential to block a potential war in Iran, you have been able to work with kind of people across the aisle. I wonder if the domestic political polarization has kind of made it more difficult even to find areas of common ground. So when we talk about Congress reclaiming its power in foreign policy, is that much harder to do even now because of the polarization that we've seen increasingly in our political system?
I think it's tough. I mean, probably shouldn't talk about this publicly, but I will. I was thinking about my staff today. I was saying, well, maybe we should reach out to Rand Paul. Rand and I have done work together and said, let's just have sort of a workplace civility code in Congress. You know, maybe we can commit to not threatening to assassinate each other over Twitter or all of the other things that's going on. So I think that there's a bunch of nonsense that's going on. I don't think that is the majority by any means of the Republican Party. There are people in the Republican Party who I go to lunch with, dinner with, who my wife knows. But I think that there are certain parts of behavior that have no place in the workplace. And can we come together on certain guidelines and then make the differences a difference about argument? So Rand Paul, who I totally disagree with on impeachment, totally disagree with on his stance with Trump, but is someone who I respect as a person who you can engage in reasoned argument and debate and isn't going to insult you and is going to actually engage with you. And there you can say, okay, you know, we can vehemently disagree on Trump's impeachment, but we can have a civil conversation, as opposed to some of the other extreme where you have violence, where you have demeaning comments. That's what I think where we have to make the distinctions.
I wonder, to that point, you know, when it comes to even issues of foreign policy, right? I question if the foundation, the sort of ability to just kind of agree on the basic principles of democracy, makes it really difficult to build on that and make solid policy in the areas of foreign policy in particular. Sort of if the House can't really stand up, why are we building on top of it? And I don't know, it is a hard and difficult question, but I'm wondering if you've given any thought on sort of where we have to really strengthen in terms of our political system to be able to be a more effective foreign policy and sort of international actor when we do go abroad.
I think we have to understand two things: that that globalization of the economy, that the technology revolution have had a hugely displacing effect on a lot of communities, on rural communities, on Black and brown communities. I mean, the racial wealth gap in this country has increased over the last 3 decades. Think about that. At the end, as we end Jim Crow, we're increasing the racial wealth gap. Now, if you live in Silicon Valley, my district is not surprising. When you have Clubhouse, this new app, which people go on, $1 billion valuation, popularized by Black people, Black artists, and no Black people are part of the IPOs or the equity, but very few. And I wonder how many rural Americans are going to participate in that wealth creation. So I think what you've seen in some sense, both by Donald Trump's campaign and Bernie Sanders' campaign, is people crying out and saying, where do we fit in this place of America? And a nation that can elect Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and have Bernie Sanders and AOC all become national figures within 4 to 5 years is a nation that is really struggling to figure out how do we have a place for every American. And so my focus, if I have any say in sort of Congress, is let's focus on creating economic opportunity for communities where they don't have to move. No one, you know, you can't tell people in Appalachia, go get a job in Palo Alto. I mean, that's crazy. How do we create economic jobs there so that people don't have to leave their hometowns, so we can create robust communities? How do we do it in Black and brown communities? And then how do we start to have conversation again with each other that is respectful, that is looking for certain common grounds, that is trying to reestablish trust? There's nothing, you know, Abraham Lincoln once said, it's in your hands what happens to the country. I think Biden has the right temperament, but it's not Biden, it's not Congress, it's all of us. Can we build a civic culture in this country again and talk to each other in ways without oozing moral judgment and put downs? And social media has a role in that too.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering too, to that sort of, as we fix the problems here at home, you know, what are other areas of commonality do you think we've talked about, at least when it comes to the foreign policy perspective, where are other areas, particularly that we haven't talked about, where there is some comedy, at least, on issues, and that there is a role for Congress there as well?
Well, I think investing in our industries of the future. Senator Schumer and I have a bill with Representative Gallagher, who have a lot of respect for her, my Republican Marine from Wisconsin. We disagree on 80% of foreign policy issues on the Armed Services Committee, but I don't question for a minute his patriotism. And Senator Young from Indiana, and we have a $100 billion bill to beef up the National Science Foundation and make it about technology and make sure that America is winning in the technologies of the future. Let me give you one concrete small example. Artificial intelligence. Well, China has a huge advantage because of data, but it turns out there's a professor at MIT, Josh Tenenbaum, who, as he describes it, is basically re-engineering Kant, meaning, when you're a child, you don't have to see a billion pictures or 1,000 pictures of a cat to understand what a cat is. The human mind is incredible, and you have certain ways of perceiving a cat, and he's able to do that. Well, I want to fund him. I want to make sure that we have that technology so that we're ahead of China and not dependent on data. And so does Mike Gallagher, and so does Todd Young, and so do a number of Republicans. So I think when you look at building things, making things, strengthening America in those ways, there can be a fair amount of bipartisan cooperation.
You did bring up China, which I think will probably be one of the biggest foreign policy challenges for this new administration. What do you see as the biggest kind of concern around China right now, and how the U.S. should respond?
My biggest concern is, do we have the investment in the technologies of the future, in our education system, in our in our health of our population? I guess I'm a fundamental optimist based on philosophical values. I don't think you can have a nation that is not open to immigration, that is basically controlling the internet, not allowing people access to any information, that is surveilling its own people, that still has massive poverty because it's a state authoritarian system. I don't bet on that over a free market, entrepreneurial system that welcomes immigrants, a system that has incredible innovation. You look at Google versus Baidu. I mean, Baidu, you can pay people to have your search rankings go up. So we have incredible advantages. 18 of the top 20 universities in the world are here. What do we need to do? We need to make sure we're investing in our education, investing in our people, investing in the technologies of the future, making sure that we have better relationships with allies, people near China than China does, with Taiwan and India and Japan and South Korea. And I think if we have that view, it doesn't have to escalate and shouldn't escalate into some kind of new Cold War. We can win with vision.
And I think that is, largely reflective of the Biden administration has, acknowledged China as a competitor, but we'll work on them where we can on issues like climate. But I am wondering, there are problems, and, what does the United States do, for example, about sort of just repressive policies? Of course, what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
How does the U.S. Push back on that? Has the opportunity passed, or is there room for the U.S. to move there?
Well, it's awful what's happening. It's a human rights catastrophe. What is happening? People in the Uyghurs situation, where people are basically, as I understand it, being having body parts used and sold, and being forced into things that are totally inhumane. I was on two bills, which said that the United States should refuse any transfer of our equipment, of our trade, of our economic activity to any official in China or any person involved with the oppression of the Uyghurs. So we could start there. We could just have economic sanctions against Chinese officials involved in that, and making sure no American goods or American products are used for those kind of oppressive techniques or oppressive techniques against Hong Kong. The point is that there are tools that we can have to stand up for our values, short of saying let's have a posture where we're escalating to a Cold War.
Wonderful. Well, I think we're actually time for some audience Q&As. So if you have a question for Representative Khanna, you can type it into the chat room, and we'll take it from there. And while we wait, I guess, to do that, I will ask sort of a broad question. But we have a new administration. We have sort of an opportunity potentially to reset. You have advocated this policy of greater restraint. What do you kind of hope foreign policy wise for the first 100 days or so of the new Biden administration?
I hope for the end of the Yemen war. I hope for a real robust engagement on climate. I hope for a thoughtful reset of the relationship with Iran. I hope for re-engagement on the peace process with Israel and Palestine to have a thoughtful two-state solution. I think we need to re-engage in Asia to start building stronger relationships again with Japan and India and South Korea. Hopefully, the one place where I do give President Trump some credit is on his efforts in North Korea. I thought that was a effort which Matthew Bolton probably tried to undermine to end that armistice, to bring a close there. I think we should engage there and to think about how we strengthen multilateral institutions on cybersecurity and issues of cybersecurity, on election interference. So there's a lot on Secretary Blinken's plate, but I think he's off to a good start.
Wonderful. All right, I will start with some of these questions. They're a little bit long, some of them, so bear with me. Our first one comes from James Tudor White, and he asks, President Biden has shown a willingness to engage proactively with his European counterparts. He's, extended an invitation to Merkel, and he is, I guess the question, but at the same time, we've had Brexit, and we know Biden's, has a personal affinity for Ireland, and he, has largely seen it as kind of a negative thing. And how do you see the relations between the United States and the United Kingdom? Are they going to be improving or downgraded as the emphasis is focused toward the European Union?
I think it will always be a strong relationship with the United Kingdom. We share, just America's obsession with the royalty there, and the cultural affinity is one that is always going to be there. But I think that what we want to move towards is encouraging a world with greater integration and greater cooperation. And the lesson of Brexit, it should be similar in part to some of the lessons here. Why was there this opposition where people were saying, slow down, we don't want this integration? What was it that was causing that? And what do we learn from that so that we can help address those concerns? And the other thing is, I went with Speaker Pelosi to this Munich conference, and the title of the conference was The West versus the Rest. And I actually had this exchange with Justin Trudeau. I said to him, my Prime Minister, I was born in Philadelphia in 1976, our bicentenary, and my grandfather spent 4 years in jail with Gandhi. So does that make me West or rest, or where does this story fit in? And Trudeau said, yes, it's a wrong frame. What we have to talk about is pluralistic democracies cooperating with each other. And so I think what we need is new imagination. We're going to become the first multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy in the world. That is a fulfillment of not just Lincoln's vision, not just our founders' vision, of the very idea of the Enlightenment that we're going to achieve if we achieve that. And so let's drive a foreign policy that is based on that. That's the extraordinary hope.
Wonderful. And this is another one on China, and it's from Matthew Burrows, and he asks, how far should competition go? Should there be another Cold War with China? Or I'll say, will there be another Cold War with China?
Well, I think that these predictive questions deny us agency. We have the opportunity to shape what the world will be with China. And if we engage in unreflective jingoism and say, we don't want any Chinese students to come here, even if they're contributing things like Zoom, which we're using. I mean, those who don't want Chinese students to come here, maybe they should boycott Zoom, or they should boycott all the things that Chinese students have helped. Then we're aggravating the tensions. If we have diplomats and statesmen who don't compromise our values, who express the moral superiority of liberal democracy over authoritarian capitalism, and don't embrace a cultural relativism, but don't believe that that leads us to a war that isn't in our interest, then I think we can avert that kind of conflict and work towards standing up for our interests and our values without having a Cold War paradigm. And and there are many people capable in our country of that kind of leadership in both parties. I mean, we need people like Bill Perry and George Shultz and even Baker, who I disagreed with on a number of things. I mean, we need people of substance to responsibly lead the nation in shaping a world that is peaceful and upholds our values and minimizes the risks of war.
I think we only have time for a few more questions, but this is actually a big one since I didn't ask it. But what is your view on the U.S. rejoining the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal?
I'm for it. I mean, I know that Lincoln gave a number of qualifications during his Senate testimony, and I think he is appropriate to review it and try to get the best deal we have. But the reality is that the Europeans are still doing that, and I think the best approach is to engage Iran so that we have some leverage on them not becoming nuclear. But I think the biggest view, in my view, is a pivot. If you do care about the competition in China, that we ought to be pivoting our foreign policy first. And what are the things that are going to build America's productive capacity and innovation? What are the things that are not going to get us tied down in more Middle East conflicts that is a total sunk cost of our development? And what are ways that we can build more alliances in Asia so that China's expansionist interests are checked?
Wonderful. Well, Congressman, we have a lot more questions and we did not get to all of them. And I'm so sorry about that. But I know that you do need to go. So I really, really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for sharing your views with all of us here.
Thank you. I hope I wasn't too long-winded. I'm sorry if we didn't get to some of the questions. So I enjoyed it. Thank you, Jen.
But I actually, I know that Chris Preval is going to actually send us out. So I will leave it to him.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thanks to everyone who joined us online. And on behalf of the entire team at the New American Engagement Initiative, I want to extend a special thank you to Representative Khanna for joining us today. This is our inaugural event in the Future Foreign Policy Series. I'm Christopher Preble. I'm the co-director with Matt Burrows of NAEI. We created this series to help with NAEI's core mission, which is to challenge prevailing assumptions governing U.S. foreign policy and to help policymakers craft sustainable and bipartisan national security strategies that can manage risk and allocate resources wisely and efficiently. It's so easy to see why we want the speakers in the foreign policy series who will include traditionally underrepresented perspectives and feature those who have a strong desire to try different approaches. And that's why it was so important to us to have Representative Khanna here. We really think he was the perfect person to help NAI kick off this important series. So thank you very much, Representative Khanna. And to everyone else, please be on the lookout for future events in the series, as well as the New American Engagement Initiative's other work. And we welcome your feedback. Our success or failure hinges on the willingness of government officials, policymakers, and leading experts to scrutinize prior assumptions and be open to new approaches that collectively rethink, reshape, and reinvigorate U.S. global engagement. Thanks again.